geek out too much. So thank you all for being here, and thank you guys for asking me to speak today. I hope you all enjoyed the break and you're refreshed for what I think is a very important topic of discussion. And it also kind of makes up the start of my research, my master research that I hope to take for the next year. So I'm exploring as much as you guys are here. So let me start with this image. Now, some of you may think that this image is kind of funny. Others of you may think, oh, I thought she was going to talk about climate change. Where is this going now? I'll just leave it up here while I introduce a little further. So climate change, it's a word we hear all the time in politics and in science. It comes with descriptions like global warming, disastrous weather events and tragedy, things like that. So at the same time, abstract solutions are depicted, such as sustainability or eco and environmentally friendliness. Scientists give us statistics at which point that we need to, we're all doomed because the temperature is going to be too high, or the percentage of decrease in emissions that we need to reach. Similarly, activists talk about the destructive forces of capitalism. They try to combat climate change by saying that we need to consume less, eat healthier and more sustainable foods, that we need to reduce, reuse, recycle, etc., etc. But what does that all really mean? It doesn't really say anything. It's like, on a day-to-day basis, how does that change anything? So I think simpler said, what climate change needs is it's some kind of cultural transformation, that we need to redefine our perspective with the environment, or our relationship with the environment, and perhaps even change our lifestyles in a very dramatic way. So then we come back to the question, what do the solutions actually look like? So instead of turning to despair, I'm going to tell you about how art can do that for you. So with that said, let's return to this cow. I said you might think it's funny. I saw a few of you snickering. You might recognize this expression as something similar to this. If you use Facebook, like we just talked about, you'll definitely recognize it. But the association between these two doesn't make any sense unless you have the concepts for both of them already in your mind. And there's two conditions for that that also make the premise of why art can work for this and why environmentalists argue what they do. So the first is that you have to be able to position yourself in relation to the other. So you have to understand that you and the cow are two different things. Not even that you are a human and the cow is an animal, but just that you are not the cow. The second is this conceptual knowledge. So someone had to at one point in your life tell you that this is an image of a cow, this is an image of an emoji, and this emoji represents something humorous. So those two together, those two conditions I just mentioned, that is what allows you to make sense of this image and the relationship between those two images. And as I said, that simple notion of subjectivity is central to what environmentalists use to argue for an ecological relationship with the world. Ecological as a concept in politics is, again, as everything that I've mentioned so far, very vague and has different definitions. But it essentially argues for a dissemination between the boundaries between humans and non-humans. So it requires that we start to view our environment not just as objects that we take from, but objects that we also give back to. So I'm not saying that we need to animate the entire world and start sympathizing with plants and rocks, as much fun as that might be, but to realize that there is a certain balance that needs to be maintained. Sort of like if in high school at one point you were taught the water cycle, and you were taught that it's a system that is made up of different components, and all those components need to be functioning properly and need to be in balance with one another for the whole system to work. So in that same way, rather than having humans and nature or humans and the environment, that you have a world system where the humans and the environment all work together. So then, I still haven't really talked about art, except these two conditions that I mentioned. We know cows probably don't really express themselves like this. However, by someone having taken this photo, they created a snapshot in time where this expression for this cow is a reality. So what they are doing, in the sense they became an artist by taking that picture, it's by representing some form of reality that contradicts the actual reality of the worlds that we live in the same way that no one really sticks out their tongue when they think it's something funny and winks at the same time. It's a bit of an odd expression to make, but that image in itself is a reality. So the ability to present that contradiction is how we can also begin to present environmental solutions. The world has a dystopia, art starts to present a utopia. So let me give you an example that might be a little more credible in the field of art history. You can take the work of the Surrealists. Their work was based on the idea of contradicting the notion of rationality that was so dominant in the early 20th century. And as a result, they sort of created these absurd images. But the only reason this is absurd is because we know that lobsters and telephones are two fundamentally different things because of the conventions that we were taught. We were taught to use a phone and eat a lobster. So when you try to understand this image by placing yourself against it or in opposition to it, you get confused because you don't really know what to do with it. And that is exactly that absurdity that I was discussing and the contradiction that was necessary to propose solutions. So let's move on to environmentalism then. And I'll show you a few examples of how artists have played with this concept of the environment, and that's antagonistic to how we see it today. So the first is this work by Edward Burtynsky. So Burtynsky creates a series of photographs that he calls manufactured landscapes. And the reason he calls them manufactured is because they're landscapes that have all been altered in some way by human activity. So there's actually nothing natural about them. You have to also consider that when these are shown properly, they're over a meter large. So this really doesn't do it justice, but that's okay. So it challenges the notion of landscape that we have by showing something that has been created by us, whereas traditionally the landscape is something that's associated with this sort of untouched, pristine, and unspoiled nature. The second way that he challenges sort of the traditional convention here is that this hyper-real image requires the viewer to sort of really look at it for a while and orientate themselves through the picture. So you realize first, okay, I'm looking at a cliff face here. And then you realize maybe later that there's a rail cut through it and that this cliff does not exist as in this way in nature. So recognizing that, and that is unnatural, then changes your perspective as a viewer because you as a human being become a co-producer of this work, having recognized that the humans are the production of this piece of work, and it's actually not nature at all that he's presenting. Another piece is the work by Olafur Eliasson, and this piece is called The Presence of Absence. It was also the central piece of an exhibition that had the exact same title. What Eliasson had was he had a chunk of glacial ice taken to a studio from Greenland. He cast this in concrete and then let the ice melt. It took about a month to melt or so. And what's left is the memory of the ice rather than the ice itself. So The Presence of Absence, I think it's a really beautiful title. The entire exhibition was focused on how natural phenomena are alive and spontaneous, just as we are. So where we would traditionally sort of think of glacial ice that moves super, super slowly, and you can't really fathom the rate at which that's produced or deconstructed. It now becomes something that's very tangible in front of your eyes. So in that way, the nature becomes a co-producer of the work also with Eliasson, because he himself could not have made that ice melt. Well, he could have, but not in a natural way. But at the same time, the ice could not have cast itself in the concrete. So it's those two forces then working together. So this work then forces you to rethink about the way that you talk about objects, the way that you talk about these natural phenomena. My third example then is, I think I need to try to, no, that doesn't work. Yeah, okay. So it's a performance, so I needed to show you a video. So this is a work called Holocenes by Lars Jan. This is a water tank, and you're seeing it from a top-down view. So where you would usually see it sort of from the side. It's an installation piece. It's usually presented in public urban spaces or in museums. It's also been presented. And it's a tank that slowly fills with water and then the water gets reduced down again, but the performer inside the tank is performing some kind of everyday task. So this man is doing something with the rope, and now he's trying to get out, which makes sense because he's drowning. But so anyway, so that again, the natural phenomenon here, water, as before we had ice, becomes a co-producer of the work. You have this sort of dynamic between the performer trying to sorry, I keep laughing at this for some reason. I'm gonna just not look at it anymore. You have the performer trying to perform this everyday task while the water is filling, so you have that competition. The inspiration was a response to flooding. So how our behavior influences the climate's behavior, and then that works again, vice versa, in the same way that Eliasson had highlighted also. So with those three examples, I wanted to show how art can be critical and attempt to redefine the concept of environments. So that then moves towards the notion of ecology I discussed in terms of reciprocity with the environment. This criticality then being embedded in the way that you relate to the work of art. So I said in the beginning, we could talk about more practical solutions. So how lifestyle and culture can change in relation to the visualization of climate change. So having established that art is critical, let's then try to take it a step further and talk about how art can be the solution or actually engage with these solutions further. I said I studied here. At EUC, you all know we're taught that different academic fields don't exist in isolation, but they interact with each other. They feed into each other like one big network of exchange. So why not have art be part of that expanded field? We always talk about how the sciences can work with each other and technologies. So modern art advocated for the autonomy of art, giving it that power to be critical, and contemporary art, I think, is becoming this expanded field of where the practice embeds itself in different methods, theories, and different possibilities to continue to meet one another. So contemporary art, you all know, doesn't constrict itself to the canvas or even to the art institutions. It appears in the streets in the forms of graffiti. It exists as public interventions or as performances, as we just saw, and sometimes even as social work. So it's this expansion that I think gives us the possibility to challenge boundaries of what art can be and mean for society. So I'm going to give you a few more examples of some artworks that I think that have already started doing this. The first is the work of Jason Decaires Taylor. He's done a TED Talk himself, and he speaks really beautifully about his work. So if anyone is interested in reading more or hearing more about it. He creates these underwater sculptures that are presented as a collection in the form of an underwater museum, he calls them. And these are placed sort of in several different locations across different continents in the world. The subject of his work is always humans or otherwise objects that relate to our consumerist lifestyles. So, for example, he's also created sculptures of cars and desk chairs. The specific sculpture you're looking at here is titled Disconnected, and it shows a faceless couple taking a selfie, which I think is pretty critical in itself. The background, you can see in other work, so you can see they're placed pretty closely to one another, so scuba divers just go down and they can see all these different pieces in one go. The sculptures, however, they're made of pH-neutral materials, and when they're placed underwater, they over time start to function as an artificial reef. So when they're first placed underwater, they look something like this. And after a while, they start to look something more like this. And the function of that is to firstly sort of revive the corals that have been broken down by all this human activity, and secondly, to distract scuba diving tourists from the natural reefs and bring them towards these, because these are, they're more durable. So in that way, by working together with scientists, Decaires Taylor has managed to both critique our lifestyle and simultaneously find a solution for it. Another field that we can see that link in, that I managed to find a nice example for, is that in activism. And that's, art and activism is not a new link, it's not a new concept. So if I ask you to imagine a protest or a demonstration, you probably come up with some sort of image in your mind that looks like this. With a lot of boards and signs and loud statements and colors. Now I could analyze the colors used here to point out how symbolism and forms of representation can be used to deliver a message, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. This is an image taken from a website, 350.org, who pride themselves in focusing on the use of art as a form of activism. So different from art to support activism, as you're seeing here. They call this Artivism very originally, and where the role is then for art to function as aesthetics and to use that to convey activist messages to people. So one of their projects is called Cough for Coal, for which Inflatables artist Arthur van Balen created a giant pair of lungs, and these actually inflated and deflated, so they look like an exaggerated live pair of lungs. So this literally larger-than-life example of activism presented a metaphor for the health of our climate and planet, and he used the lungs specifically because they're a fragile and obviously very crucial component to the human body, and again, commenting on the relationship between human activity and nature there. So art as social activity, such as in this case, I think is even more powerful than the example I mentioned before, because the collaborative efforts necessary to create such pieces influence multiple people's perspectives even before the piece is released and shown to the public. So one more example of that could be community gardens. I don't have a picture of one of these, but they exist all in many major cities. They're starting to come alive now. And these community gardens both focus simultaneously on beautifying public urban space, strengthening communities, and combating sustainability issues. So ultimately, I think the creation of any work in teams, no matter what the field, is likely to make a more well-rounded solution. So what I've shown you just now is two sets of examples of artworks relating with the notion of environments. The first demonstrated how art can be critical and reflexive, and the second presented possibilities of what can happen when art moves beyond its constricted elitist idea and interacts with other disciplines. So these examples didn't actually offer you any practical solutions for how you should change your life and how we're going to combat climate change. But the closest I've come, and I think is something that we should really hold dear, is how artists are searching for a change in perspective on how we view our environment. But perhaps, maybe that's all we need for now. And maybe that is exactly the building blocks that we need to move beyond. To implement a more ecological outlook on ourselves and the worlds we inhabit, and to break down these boundaries between humans and nature, to appreciate the world in a reciprocal relationship with ourselves. Exactly as this manifesto piece by Eliasson states in the top line, art asks you to consider your relationship to the world. So to return to where I began, the fact that we can see our expression in this cow shows that I think we do have the capacity to hold this kind of sustainable relationship with the environment that we've kind of lost in the last half century. So rather than seeing it as an object and reducing it to numbers to sustain our livelihood. So of course art isn't going to be the only solution, but I think it can definitely bring us towards one. And I hope I've inspired you to think about it further. Thank you.